Well, greetings, students. Good to be with you as always. Today, I'd like to move on from the overall dietary strategies that we discussed in part one and on to more specific food components that make up our diet. And basically, three components I want to look at, and that is sugar, salt, and fats. Actually, I had a hard time picking a Bible verse for this lesson. And the verse that I ultimately came up with is if you have found honey, eat only enough. The verse really ends with lest you vomit, which is kind of gross, so I left it off. But the verse warns us that while we can enjoy sweets as treats, we have to keep in mind that they are just treats and not foods. And we need to be careful not to overindulge. All right, so here are the big three: sugar, fats, salts. So you might ask, why the focus on these three particular food groups? Well, as it turns out, the three of these groups work together to drive our appetite. In fact, the right combination of the three in any food product, from spaghetti sauce to chips, results in a more or less ideal tasting sensation, which is called by this fellow Michael Moss, who wrote the book with the same name. It's called the bliss point. And these substances are often snuck into processed food in a way that you wouldn't even expect. So you really have to read the label to see how often you find these things together and in substantial amounts. All right, let's begin with what is possibly the biggest health offender of the bunch: sugar. And possibly the biggest source of sugar is corn, as high fructose corn syrup. We'll be talking about that a little bit more as we go on. And it's really amazing to see how many foods are prepared from corn. You see here we have breakfast, we have an energy drink, a snack, I don't beer. Actually, yeah, beer does contain certain components of corn, grain, for example. Um, that what are those? Cheetos, right? Cheetos. Not that I've ever had a Cheeto, but those are Cheetos, and we have cookies and even dog food. So corn is really a ubiquitous product. As I mentioned, corn is used to produce the sweetener HFCS, but also corn is used to produce starch and corn oil. So we can see already that two of the three ingredients of interest, sugar and fat, can readily be prepared from this one agricultural product. And for better or for worse, corn production has nearly doubled since 1980. So if we look here, we see that it's kind of gotten close to doubling, whereas products like fruits and nuts and citrus have really essentially stayed on a pretty much level course. They haven't changed much over that same time frame. And not coincidentally, sugar consumption has increased drastically over the past few decades in a manner similar to corn, with consumption levels 2 or 3 times the most liberal daily recommended doses. The World Health Organization recently reduced their recommended daily limit on sugar intake from 50 to 25 grams. And there's about 4 grams in a teaspoon. So you can see this is kind of where their limit was, and their limit now would be way down here. That'd be about 6 teaspoons, or about 25 grams of sugar. And that's quite a low amount of sugar compared to, my goodness, look at how much people are taking now. 25. Typical in a 20 to 25 teaspoons of roughly 100 grams a day of sugar. Well, your instructor is a chemist at heart, so you're stuck with some chemistry. But not to worry, I'll try to keep it simple. The sugar known and loved by the body is glucose. a simple monosaccharide, a very useful fuel nutrient when taken in moderation. Glucose can come from three primary sources: table sugar, also known as sucrose, which is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose. Starches are another form of sugar, which is kind of a polymeric form of sugar, and you can have complex starches which are broken down to form glucose slowly, or you can have simple carbohydrates, simple starches, which are broken down to form glucose quickly, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then we have this kind of newcomer, high fructose corn syrup, or HFCS, which is a mixture, it's just a blend of glucose and fructose. This is produced from corn chemically, but it's basically a blend of glucose and fructose in solution in water. Okay, so the thing I want you to keep in mind about HFCS, because there's a lot of confusion about this, but really from the point of view of the way our body handles HFCS, it is essentially the same thing as table sugar, as sucrose. Okay, they're essentially an equal mixture of glucose and fructose. So I like to look at it that they're both equally bad. Well, you might wonder, what is the fuss about sugar? What's the problem? Well, of course, one problem obviously is that it's a source of calories, which contributes mightily to obesity. But another more subtle problem, and that I want to talk about with you folks because you're healthcare professionals, is that it can damage microvessels. And it does this by a process called glycation. Glycation occurs when sugars, such as glucose or fructose, react covalently with certain amino acid side chains of proteins, most notably lysine. These products are often referred to as advanced glycation products, or AGEs. The glycated proteins can't function normally, okay? And they appear in the body essentially as foreign molecules and undergo immunological attack, oxidative attack, resulting in inflammation and damage to the blood vessels which bear them. And for those of you who are a little chemistry oriented, this figure shows a bit more of the chemistry involved in the process. Now, in the specific case of glucose, you can minimize glycation by minimizing the rise in glucose levels in the bloodstream after eating some carbohydrates. And foods that have a very small increase in glucose are said to have a low glycemic index, meaning that compared to eating pure glucose in an equal amount in terms of its carbohydrate, that you get a lower amount of glucose in the blood. The glycemic load is the product of the glycemic index and the carbohydrate content in a serving of that food. It represents the real glucose impact of eating the food. The glycemic load for a serving of a fruit, say an apple or an orange, here we see an apple or an orange, you see that glycemic load is relatively small compared to a serving of apple juice or orange juice. And that's probably because the fiber in the fruit slows down the absorption of the glucose. And again, we see that the glycemic index of, say, white rice, okay, which is a simple carbohydrate very quickly broken down in the body and absorbed, is much higher than the more complex carbohydrate brown rice. Okay, so this slide indicates how glycemic load can give you a pretty good idea of what the actual sugar impact, if you will, of a food is. Two statements from recent biomedical research literature, I think, provide a good perspective regarding dietary sugars. First one is fructose is a more potent glycoxidation agent as compared to glucose, and that helps explain its detrimental effects. So all things being equal, fructose is the nastier component of that fructose-glucose combination. And the second thing is that maintaining recommended carbohydrate intake with utilization of low glycemic index foods generates a more favorable vascular profile. In other words, having a food that has a lower glycemic index is better than having a food that has a high glycemic index when it comes to damaging the vasculature through the glycation. Well, if that's a little confusing, let's try this as a summary. We can think of sugars as having adverse health effects on a sliding scale, with going in this direction, with the worst actors being those that quickly release fructose and glucose into the bloodstream, and the somewhat better situations when you have fructose and glucose released slowly into the bloodstream. Processed food, which contains added sucrose or high fructose corn syrup, are by far the worst actors. Okay, just cutting those out. If you remember nothing else, just cutting out added sugar. Okay, really reduces your glucose, your glycation load tremendously. Okay, and eating things like fruits. Okay, fruits are vegetables. Complex carbohydrates, whole grains, really gets that glucose released in such a way that it's slowly released. The body can deal with it, can process it before we get high blood levels that would result in glycation. And just to bring this message home in terms of specific disease states, sugars and advanced glycation end products they produce have been implicated in a number of disease conditions. So let's look at a few of them. We have cardiovascular disease, no question about it. But who would have thought, right? Even cancer. And then dementia, no question about it. So there's a lot of things, and it makes sense because when you damage the blood vessels that are supplying end organs, you're going to damage the organ. In fact, studies that have looked at the relationship between blood glucose and dementia suggest that there is actually no lower limit for glucose levels in terms of risk. Fascinating, isn't it? So here we don't see one of these J-shaped curves. We don't see something like, let's say this, we don't see that kind of a phenomenon, but rather what we see is a continuous relationship between glucose levels and risk. So that in effect, and I know it's a little scary, but even one can of soda, so to speak, has some kind of a damaging effect on our vasculature. So while it's nice to see all these organizations trying to come up with a lower limit for added sugar, really any added sugar is not a good idea to expose yourself to. And lastly, in terms of sugar, I want to mention the role of sugar in cholesterol production. As you may recall, cholesterol is synthesized in the body from acetate. Acetate is the precursor. And the primary source of acetate is glucose. Fats are really only secondary sources. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us when we hear that people are concerned about sugar causing dyslipidemia, possibly to the same extent or even a greater extent than fats. So that's my little transition slide, and why don't we go ahead and move on to fats. And let's begin with what's in the news. You see some of these things in the news here. The big fat surprise, a book about why butter, meat, and cheese belong in a healthy diet. Here's Time magazine telling us we can eat butter, and then there's all these pictures that are displayed in various websites showing that bacon and sausage are really the best thing for us to be eating. I'm not so sure. Why don't we have a little bit more of a look at this? Well, once again, our old friend chemistry comes to the fore here. And we have to talk a little bit in terms of chemistry because there are different kinds of fats. And what are we talking about when we're talking about the different kinds of fats? Well, essentially, we're talking about triglycerides. And this part here, which is the fatty acid component, there are three of them. One, two, three. Three of those on each triglyceride. Okay, so when the body takes in a triglyceride, it splits off the fatty acids and we metabolize those individually. And as I'm sure you all know, we have our saturated fats, which you could just look at them. Uh, they tend to be solid at room temperature. The molecules fit together real nicely, whereas uh, whereas the unsaturated fats, with a lot of these, especially with a lot of these cis bonds and the double bonds, tend to be oils because the molecules don't really slip over each other and fit into a nice crystal structure as much as they do with the saturated fats. So within the unsaturated fats, we have two very important subclasses, the omega minus 3 and the omega minus 6 fats. These are very important subclasses that we're going to want to kind of keep our minds on. And I often call these PUFAs for polyunsaturated fatty acids. Yeah, I know, too much chemistry. Well, let's just kind of look at the big picture here. The omega minus 3s, what I want you to kind of keep in mind is the source. They come from flaxseed, from nuts in general, and specific kinds of oils. Canola oil and olive oil are pretty rich in omega minus 3 fatty acids. And of course, fish are the biggies. Fishies have EPA and DHA, which are really what we're looking at. What we find in plant sources is really the metabolic precursor to EPA and DHA, and the conversion in human beings is not that high. So I have to tell you honestly, you're better off eating the fish, or in this case, possibly even taking the EPA DHA supplements. So that was the omega minus 3s, and the omega minus 6s are the biggie. There is corn oil. Okay, corn oil has linolenic acid, which ultimately produces the arachidonic acid we're going to talk about in a little bit. But I want you to keep in mind that the omega minus 6s are in corn oil. Okay, so why be concerned about this omega 3, omega 6 situation? Well, very simple. A number of studies have shown that omega minus 3 fats have an anti-inflammatory effect, where omega minus 6 have a pro-inflammatory effect. One theory is that omega minus 6 fats convert to pro-inflammatory prostaglandins. Okay, here's an omega minus 6 fat from linolenic acid, a major corn oil constituent that goes to arachidonic acid and ultimately to the inflammatory prostaglandins. And the idea is that linolenic acid are the ingredients in canola oil, olive oil, flaxseed, nuts, converts to EPA, and just as well EPA and DHA will do this themselves. And these compounds, EPA and DHA, block the enzyme that converts arachidonic acid to prostaglandins. It blocks several of those enzymes. This is a somewhat, I have to admit, controversial area. There's, really kind of some data showing that it may not be exactly this way, but I think it's substantial. And the bottom line is that while both omega minus 3 and omega minus 6 are in fact polyunsaturated fatty acids. Sounds like, oh, they have to be good. Not necessarily. The overwhelming data is showing that the omega minus 3 from corn oil, excuse me, the omega minus 3 from canola, olive oil, from fish, have a beneficial effect. Where those the omega minus 6 from corn oil seem to have a deleterious effect. Well, of course, the story of fats wouldn't be complete without discussing the one true villain in this class of compounds, that is trans fats. Okay, so here is a picture of a trans fat versus a cis fat. It has to simply do with the disposition of the carbons across that double bond. I'm sure you're quite familiar with that. And these come about when polyunsaturated fats are partially hydrogenated. Now, this is done intentionally to leave some of the double bonds in place, and it really prolongs the shelf life, certain physical properties of the fat. But the problem from a metabolic point of view is that these trans fats don't occur naturally. They don't occur in nature. So our digestive enzymes don't know what to do with them, and they hang around and they wreak havoc. So you really want to have, to the extent you can help it, zero trans fat in your diet. And you have to be careful, because you can look at a label and of course you're looking to see that it says no trans fat, but it's a little misleading, because a food can have up to half a gram of trans fat and still call itself no trans fat. And if you're having 3 or 4 servings, you can see that you can end up to a couple grams of trans fat. So the other way is to look and see if it says partially hydrogenated on the label. If it has any partially hydrogenated, that means it has some trans fat. And then I would definitely say think about finding another product to use. And the wild card, I called this saturated fats. Boy, that's not good. I gotta watch my spelling. The wild card in this whole discussion of fats is saturated fats. This is a tough call to really say where they fit into the health spectrum. But I'm going to go with this Medline conclusion, Cochrane conclusion. Current evidence does not, and let me show you where I am. Current evidence does not clearly support cardiovascular guidelines that encourage high consumption of polyunsaturated fats and low consumption of total saturated fats. Wow, is that a convoluted statement or what? In other words, they're saying that really with the current state of the art, it's difficult to say whether or not polyunsaturated fats are good and saturated fats are bad. But I think if we look at the actual data here and try to see what we get in this plot here, this forest plot, we see that if we look at total saturated fats, basically it's a neutral in terms of the risk. And then if we look at our omega minus 3s, remember omega minus 3s is a subcategory of PUFAs that comes from fish, comes from olive oil, canola oil, nuts. You see clearly there's a beneficial effect. There's a risk lower than 1. And I think that's been shown time after time. And then if we look at trans fat, and there's no question about trans fat, I don't think anybody would debate that your risk is elevated for taking, when you're involved with ingesting trans fat. That stuff is just bad. Okay. So again, just to summarize what I know is complex and a little bit challenging, the unhealthy fats are the trans fats, no question. And then we have our healthy fats, which are omega minus 3 PUFAs, okay? And then we have those kind of fats which you might say are neutral, personally, I would say they're bad. They're not good. Omega minus 6, corn oil kind of fats, and saturated fats. And of course, the best way to get the omega minus 3 is eating fish. You know, just like Jesus and the apostles. I hope you're laughing, guys. But another good source is canola oil. And yeah, I know, it's kind of corny. I took this slide from the canola oil consortium or whatever. But, you know, I've checked it out in other sources, and it's pretty accurate. You can see here that the alpha-linolenic acid, which I'm sure you remember like a hole in the head at this point, but that's the omega minus 3 fatty acid that's in canola oil. You see that that's really quite a decent substituent of canola oil, whereas you know in let's say olive oil has a little bit, 1% olive oil. And then you look at the rest of these, it's just a trace. So actually, that's why I got to tell you, I exclusively use canola oil, expeller press canola oil. But olive oil is not a bad choice. Now, if you look at corn oil, you might say, well, you know, Dr. Matroka, corn oil has 1% omega minus 3, just like olive oil. Yeah, but the problem with corn oil is that it has so much of the omega minus 6 in it. Okay, whereas olive oil only has a little. So the ratio of omega minus 6 to omega minus 3 is not too bad with olive oil. It's a lot better with canola oil, but corn oil is definitely a problem. Now, the other thing to look at here is the saturated fat. And you see all of these that are sort of towards the top, the canola oil, corn oil, olive oil. Those are all pretty low in saturated fat. That's a good thing. Then when you get down here towards the bottom, palm oil, coconut oil, you get more saturated fat. And again, that's debatable. Some people think that's okay. I don't think it's such a good idea to be eating all that saturated fat, but maybe at best one can consider that neutral. Yeah, let me leave it at that for now. Well, lastly, we end with our old friend salt. As with so many dietary components, even this one is undergoing some change in thinking about what are the appropriate dietary limits. And it's interesting that recently it was found that there's insufficient power to confirm clinically important effects of dietary advice on salt substitution and cardiovascular mortality. And in reality, it turns out that the safest range of salt intake is 2.5 to 5 grams per day, which is quite a bit, you know. I mean, and that's pretty much what most of the world's population is consuming. So, unlike sugar, where we saw that even where we saw a tremendous increase in consumption, way above what it should be in anybody's book, here, really, when it comes to salt, most people are pretty much where they should be. And again, we see that kind of a J-shaped relationship that, you know, if you're getting really very low levels of salt, you can run into trouble. And there's a lot of data suggesting that now, even for cardiac patients who are taking extremely low input of salt, that it can actually cause problems at very low levels. But you have this kind of ideal range, and it makes sense. I mean, salt is an important component of our diet. We know that. So in reality, it may turn out, and in one of the papers you have as a reading assignment does a nice job explaining this, that it's not the salt itself that's the nasty when it comes to so many health problems, particularly cardiovascular problems. But it may be that salt is a bystander and just happens to be present in the foods that contain the real evil ingredient, which may well end up being sugars. Okay, so having gone through that boring or invigorating discussion of food constituents, depending on your point of view, I do want to leave you with a caution, and that is don't fret too much over individual food constituents, or what some people might call nutrientism. Rather, concentrate on whole, intact foods, unprocessed foods, foods typically you find around the edges of a supermarket. Those kind of foods that don't have ingredient labels because they're just the way the good Lord made them, and foods that are kept refrigerated because they don't contain preservatives. And if you can't remember anything else about our discussion of diet, please remember this one quote: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. All right, my friends, that's it for now. God willing, I'll see you again in class. Take care.